We already know that Assassin's Creed Shadows looks great on a high-end PC, but how does it scale down the lower-end hardware, and how is the PC version in general? Based on what we have seen on consoles, serious concessions might be needed to get a consistent 60 FPS on lower-grade GPU hardware, so optimized settings are going to be key here. But before I get into optimized settings, so kindly worked out by DF contributor Mohammed, I want to talk about the user experience and options. Loading the game up for the first time, there's only a very brief section of explicit shader compilation occurring, perhaps at most visibly being around half a minute or so on a Ryzen 5 3600. In-game, while playing, there did not appear to be any substantial shader compilation stutter over many hours of enjoyment. Based on my conversation with the developers, PSO compilation stutter should not be a key issue in Assassin's Creed Shadows. In the aspect of frame time stability in general, Assassin's Creed seems to be one of the better titles we have seen lately, but I would definitely say it's not as good as something like Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2. When running around the game world on horseback, the game can manage to get a really great 60 FPS, even on a low-end CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600 as we're seeing here. But occasionally when you hit the towns, or transition to new map zones, it would appear, you can see a frame time spike at around 30 milliseconds or a little higher. They do happen at the exact same place each and every time you run past an area I've found, and they will even afflict large processors like the Ryzen 7 9800 X3D as we are seeing here with VSync set to off. It would be nice if these were not there at all, of course, but they are not exactly peppering the experience everywhere you go, rather they are more distant from one another usually. If they do bother you though, like they do bother me, I recommend a frame rate cap like you see here with me using VSync on that 9800 X3D, which tends to limit their visual and measurable severity, almost getting rid of them actually. Even with that aside, I think the frame times tend to be pretty okay in this new AC game. Another well-handled aspect are the menu options. They are well presented with useful scaling, there are plentiful options, and there are meaningful preview images. One of my favorite aspects of the menu options are how dynamic resolution is handled, with it being able to be combined with DLSS or other upscalers, where the quality setting of the upscaler then affects the minimum and maximum resolutions, where 25% on the scale, for example, represents the performance mode of the scaler. The dynamic resolution system itself is a bit slow to react in comparison to other games, but it is definitely still useful and heavily recommended by me in getting optimized settings. So there's definitely a lot of good user experience stuff here in Shadows, but that does not mean everything is perfect. The options menu is good in the Ubisoft style way, but some options still require full game reloads. And sometimes toggling an option to a different level of quality will mean having strange performance or slightly worse performance that you really wouldn't expect. Although not explicitly mentioned in the menu, I still recommend giving the game a full restart after you check out the options' visual differences if you want perfectly consistent and expected performance. My biggest user experience issue I have with the game is in the way cutscenes are presented. They are limited to one aspect ratio and one frame rate. Black bars on top and bottom, and 30 FPS, and frame generation does not work on them. Obviously, this leads to a huge discrepancy in fluidity between gameplay and cutscenes, and it is extremely jarring. That is just for the PCs right now. PCs of the future, of course, will have GPUs that are magnitudes more powerful than we have access to at the moment. So the cutscenes being limited to 30 is already jarring on PCs of today, and it'll only be more jarring on PCs of the future. I'd say this is a very short-sighted decision. They really ought to have an option in the menu to unlock the cutscene frame rate officially instead of having to potentially rely on mods that might have visual issues. A big problem with this FPS limit though in cutscenes and in dialogue sequences is that it does not even lock to 30 FPS, but on PC it locks to a very strange 31 FPS. Those in the audience may know from me ripping on titles of the past for this that this means on a VSync display the game will have a constant judder and stutter as no refresh rate will perfectly divide into that 31. On a VRR display it is not actually that much better as there are issues with frame time limiting without VSync on as it shows erratic frame times when this FPS limit comes into play. So it really doesn't look smooth on any display, really. Basically, the cutscenes look jittery and stuttery no matter what your setup is, and it should be really obvious in all the B-roll I've shown so far of the cutscenes in a big way. Considering the console version's locked to a perfectly fine and normal 30 FPS that fits perfectly into a VSync container, this definitely needs fixing on PC. The game's issue with the jittery frame times in cutscenes applies as well to the game's in-game frame rate limiter. The footage I was showing off earlier of the game locking really well to 60 FPS even on a Ryzen 5 3600 was done via using standard VSync. If you were to use instead the in-game FPS limiter as we are seeing here, while sitting still it kind of works okay, but while moving around it seems to have a lot of trouble keeping the frame times even, which makes for an uneven display even on a VRR monitor. So in my opinion, if you're going to be limiting the FPS in this game, as I definitely would recommend like I would for most games, then look elsewhere instead of using the in-game frame rate limiter. I recommend something like VSync or something like Special K. The last user experience issue I have has to do with some unexpected performance. Now, I said the game is stable earlier, barring when you change options. But I have found that GPU scaling can actually be a bit temperamental based upon time of day and where you're looking. Basically, near forested areas like we can see here on the map, and I'm staring across this water right into a forest where this base is on the right, the game can get much heavier on the GPU at dusk than it is at night or during the daytime before it. So here during the day on the RTX 5090, I'm at 74 FPS as the sun is high in the sky. But as evening moves on and the sun goes down, the FPS keeps getting lower and lower until it hits a nadir of 50. And then it starts to slowly creep up again as night is starting to begin. When the sun finally goes out and is extinguished, the FPS suddenly shoots up from the low 60s back to 74 where I was earlier. This happens on all GPUs and not just big NVIDIA ones, and the lower end GPUs actually have it quite worse. On the RTX 4060, for example, I measured it hitting a low of 35 in this scene, completely bottoming out DRS and having some slightly wobbly frame times to boot, and then it rockets up to 60 again after sundown. Part of me thinks this is not intended behavior that I'm seeing across the game world here in specific places, as if you adjust a setting like shadows up or down a notch or toggle it back and forth while this is happening, the performance recovers completely. For example, here I'm in the 50s on the RTX 5090 during dusk as I showed earlier, then I go into the options and I toggle the shadow quality down and up, and all of a sudden I'm back at 70. Whatever the issue is, it is confusing and it needs looking at, I think. Now getting to optimized settings themselves, I have two specific priorities for this game which limit optimized settings to a degree. I do not want to get rid of the game's current generation features which drastically affect its visuals. For one, you have RTGI that I just won't turn off, as it has a huge impact on visual quality in spite of it saving performance in a meaningful way, as we can see here. It is such a big reason why this game looks the way it does, and it is key to the game's visual quality. I also do not want to get rid of strand-based hair, as you spend so much time with your character right in front of the camera in this game, and having that character look worse I think is antithetical to optimized settings which try and make quality nips and tucks that are less obvious. These two big features are cut in the performance mode on those base consoles, but that is a step too far for my taste. Still, there are other useful optimizations used in the console's performance modes that we can take advantage of for optimized settings. There are quite a lot of settings in this game when you scroll through that menu, so I will not highlight all of them in video form, but I will just show off the key ones to give you a sense of it all before I put up the usual charts. Let's start with those settings that differ from console's performance mode and with RTGI. Here, a simple optimization for RTGI is to only use diffuse GI. You will lose that nice specular sheen on surfaces and of course on places like water, but it will save you 15% or more performance depending upon what you are looking at, and I think that is worth it in my book for a lower quality GPU. Another small optimization you could do is reduce RTGI quality. Now I'm not sure if this setting is working completely, but based upon measurements, you get scarcely a difference in image quality on medium versus ultra high for a small uplift in performance, while low negatively impacts visuals in an obvious way, and you only see a 4% uplift in performance. So I definitely recommend the medium setting here for optimized settings. With regard to hair strands, the best optimization here is to keep hair strands localized just to the player. In scenes with multiple NPCs like this one, we can see a nice 6% performance uplift at this middle distance just by having the characters at a distance use standard hair cards. In the grand scheme of things, I would say it is worth it, and it is in fact what the consoles do in their quality modes. Now going over to the settings, we want to crib a couple other settings from those console performance mode, and let's start with the shadows. Here the consoles in their performance mode use the medium setting, as we can see with the lack of precision and aliasing on the shadows on the floor and on the paper divider on the wall. It makes sense that they do this on console, of course, because medium saves around 18% performance in this scene here over the ultra high quality setting. They're obviously less sharp in that aspect, but it's a far less obvious cut to the presentation than cutting out something like RTGI. Another big win that the consoles take advantage of is in distance level detail. Looking at the background trees and plants here, we can see that the Xbox Series X in its performance mode fails to have as high detailed vegetation as very high or ultra high, but it lines up well with the standard high setting. This is a good move, as seen on PC, where going from ultra to high increases performance by around 9%, being in line with the performance of medium while still being a little bit better on the visual side. This is definitely a sweet spot for optimization. Light sources is another option to save performance with, where we can see here the Xbox Series X version in its performance mode uses the medium setting for light sources, which reduces the distance at which lights become shadow casting. It is more conservative here, but that makes sense. Going to medium on PC increases performance by a massive 32% in this scene. So this is good for low-end GPUs, but mid to high-end GPUs, I would say, should use the high setting here to not lose out on some shadow casting lights up close. The last setting I want to highlight is virtual texturing quality, specifically for GPUs below 12 gigs of VRAM. As we can see here, in terms of objective VRAM measuring, the medium and low settings save a similar amount of VRAM, yet this game is actually pretty VRAM efficient. Low has noticeably worse texturing though. They look like quarter res textures in comparison to medium or high. So medium is keeping the same texture quality as high while reducing VRAM. It appears to do this by evicting higher quality textures more readily. So if you're playing the game on medium, like we can see here, you can sometimes see textures at a distance looking low resolution, like the low textures would, and they'll whip up to higher quality when the camera is getting closer. This setting though is key for GPUs with lower than 12 gigs of VRAM. In total, this is what the setting spread looks like. The low optimized settings here are meant for something like an RTX 4060. That is more similar to base consoles, while the high optimized setting here will take less quality concessions in key places and are better off for higher end GPUs like the RTX 4070 Super, 4070 Super Ti, etc. and above that. If we look at the optimized settings performance wins at 1440p DLSS performance mode, we can see how optimized settings will save a big chunk of performance. Indoors here, we see a huge 40% uplift versus the max. Outdoors, it takes the 4070 Ti Super from being just above 60 FPS to now being 91 FPS, increasing performance by 38%. So there are big wins to be had. On an RTX 4060 using DLSS in quality mode at 1080p using low optimized settings, which includes RTGI and hair strands, we see some okay performance on screen here given what is being rendered. It is typically between 50 and 70 FPS depending upon what is happening, where you are, and what time of day it is. It seems to be pretty easy on the GPU, with it often being above 60 FPS and almost reaching 70 FPS at times. But in those more intense areas like combat, dense locations as cities, or dense vegetation, it can definitely bring it down into the 50s. This is typically fine for VRR play, but I've noticed that lower end GPUs like the RTX 4060 playing this game tend to have some larger frame time swings than I'm used to, even when GPU limited. Now check this out. Here we're watching the RTX 4060 being paired against the RTX 3070. If you look at the average frame rates, you'll see that there's only an 8% difference between the two in the RTX 3070's favor, which isn't even that big. But if you look at the frame times while running through this area on horseback, you'll see that the RTX 3070 has a much more stable frame time graph, whereas the RTX 4060 shows some really gnarly frame times there. I'm not exactly sure what could be causing it, but you do have a compute deficit there on the RTX 4060, as well as worse PCIe speed and of course worse bandwidth overall. So for benchmarks you see out there in the wild for this game, you may see two GPUs being close to one another, but in reality I found that they can actually have quite a different gameplay and frame time experience. One way to help even out the experience on the RTX 4060, of course, would be to use dynamic resolution scaling and, of course, a frame rate cap from a reliable source. Getting to the end of this video, Assassin's Creed Shadows has a lot of scalability, and I think you can get a pretty okay experience on a lower end GPU with that GPU scaling. Still, there are some issues. It is not exactly a completely stutter-free experience, with some traversal stutterers peppering the experience when you get to towns, for example. And as I say this, a patch just dropped in the middle of my making this video, which added in stutters each and every time you use contextual items, like the doors in the assassin's dens. Here, each time I am opening the door, there's a new stutter for each time I open it. Yeah, this is not nice to see. There are some other issues as well beyond these frame time spikes that need developer examination. A setting like RTGI quality, for example, is it really working above medium? It's really hard to tell. Sunsets, should they really be taking performance like they are right now? That is also hard to know. Hopefully patches will take a look at these things in time and improve the experience. And until then, I hope you enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, help on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.